Hello and welcome to my video presentation. My name is Paul Brett. I'm a Senior Software Support Analyst supporting IBM Transformation Extender. Today's topic is using the Azure SQL adapter with IBM Transformation Extender. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter at PaulBrettIBM. Let's start this process at the Azure Portal. The first application I'm going to click on is SQL Servers. Within SQL Servers, you will note that I've created one server called IBM-Azure-SQL-1, and then within that server I have created one database. I click on SQL Databases here. I've called it IBM-Database-1. Within the database, we can click on the query editor here, and then we get to log in. I've created one user called IBM-admin. This was created during the database creation process. Use my password to log in, and then we've got the standard query window that we're used to seeing in a SQL Server Management Studio. I've created one table called test1. I will open the query that I used to create that table. Here we go. This is the query I used to create the table. It starts with create. I've added three fields: name, which is a varchar, age, which is an int, and emp start date, which is a date. I then also inserted a couple of values. All of this has been commented out so that it doesn't accidentally run. The only thing I'm going to run now is the select statement at the bottom. And you will note my two rows are in the database. We'll be using these two rows and adding a third row when we come to run our maps later. Let's have a quick look at the overview. And in the connection strings section, the connection strings in any of these tabs here, ado.net, JDBC, ODBC, PHP, etc., any of those will give you key points that you need to connect via the map in the adapter connection settings later. So it's worth taking a note of that string, which I've done for my own documents, and we'll use that when building and running the map later. So there we go, that's the Microsoft Azure console part of the process. Let's now move on to the Design Studio. Here we are in the Design Studio. I have one project called Azure SQL, and within that project I have a type tree called generic, basic type tree that has a text blob that I can use, and I also have a type tree called query_test1. Now this is a type tree that I have built manually based on the information that I'm seeing when I run my maps that retrieve the data. I do believe it may be possible to import this type tree using the Database Interface Designer, but only if you have installed the latest ODBC drivers from Microsoft, along with the additions that allow you to connect via ODBC to an Azure SQL instance. Moving on, we have one map called example.mms. Let's open that source map now. Within the source map I have three executable maps. The first one, test1, it only has an output card, and within that card I have a get rule. This rule uses my secure name to connect to IBM-Azure-SQL-1 .database.windows.net. It has -db and the name of the database, IBM-database-1. It has the -port option, which is the default port for SQL Server 1433. And then onto username, IBM-admin, the password that I've used, then the schema, the default schema for the only user that I have is DBO. Then the name of the table, test1, and I've got some additional flags here, QTY1, LSN0, and then finally AS0, which is a flag that tells how many rows to retrieve, and 0 means all of them. and finally a -t to get a trace if things go wrong. So let's build and run this map. Build the map now and run the map now. The map has completed successfully, and in our miscellaneous folder, if we open up output.txt, you will note that the map has successfully retrieved the output data that we had in our table. Paul 50 and a date, Charlotte 25 and a date. Okay, that's good. That's test 1 over. Test 2 does pretty much the same thing, but this time it retrieves the data in an input card. So the same connect string is used in the adapter command. The adapter that I've selected is, of course, Azure SQL. The structure for the input card is the one that I told you that I built earlier. Basically, it's an infinite number of rows. Each row is terminated with a line feed, and in between the columns is a vertical bar symbol, and it's expecting data to be in every column. On the output side, I'm just using the package function to package up everything that's been retrieved and write it using the file adapter to output.txt, again in much the same way that test 1 did. So if I just overwrite this output file for the moment with the word stuff and click save, back to my map, if I build and run, which is finished, we should note that the output has been updated yet again with the content of my table. Okay, so my third and final map is test 3, which I have only one output card. I have used exactly the same structure that I've used on input, and this time I have added an index and manually populated one row. In my connection string, I have dropped some of the options that we had on the end of the connection string for a source, but I do have an extra one that wasn't there before, -wm insert. Now there are two options that we can use here, insert or update. I'm not going to use the update today, I'm just going to be doing some inserting, so this will add to the information that's already in the table. So I'm expecting it to add a row called Megan 23 and put in the current date for the third column. So let's build and run this map. The map has completed successfully. Output.txt hasn't changed because obviously this card is writing directly to the Azure database. I could run either test 2 or test 1 again to update this information, but let's switch back to the portal instead and go to the query editor. Let's log in, and I'm going to open the query that I had open before, and I'm going to let that run. Everything else is commented, it's just the select that's going to run. Click the run button here and you'll see the 3 rows have been populated now, the third one being inserted by my test 3 map, the Megan row. So there we go. That is how to execute Azure SQL maps from Design Studio. Next up, we'll do the same using Design Server. Here we are at the IBM Transformation Extender Design Server, version 10.03. As you can see, I'm accessing it through a browser and I'm at the login screen. I'll go ahead and log in now, and you will see that I have no projects currently. I'm going to import the project that we created in the previous section, the Design Studio. Let's import the entire project. The import happens fairly quickly. I click close and I now have one project, IBM Azure SQL. Clicking on that, you'll see that I have 2 schema, generic and query_test1, and I have my 3 maps. Let's start with test 1. Test 1, if you remember, is just an output card that writes to a file called output.txt and uses a get rule to attach to the Azure SQL instance. Let's build and run that map and see the results we get. The run was successful. Right click on the output card, view data. As you can see, I have the 3 rows that have been inserted in the previous section. Before I run the next map, test 2, I'm going to go to my console here, my Azure Portal, and run some query sections to drop the table and recreate it with only the 2 rows. Okay, so drop table first, then create table, and then insert the 2 rows one at a time. Okay, when I run this query now, you'll note there are only 2 rows in the table. Back to the maps, let's open test 2, and if you remember, this map does the same as test 1, but instead of using a get rule in an output card, this actually uses an input card. Let's bring up the properties of that input card. As you can see, it uses the Azure SQL adapter. The connection properties are all listed as fields, some of which are masked, and some more there in the action properties. The output card is once again set to write to a file called output.txt. Now this map should build and run exactly as it did in the previous section. So we build first, build was successful, hit the run button, and the run is complete. And because we recreated the table and inserted 2 rows, I'm expecting this output, as it does, to have 2 rows. So that's fantastic. So finally, let's fire up our test 3 map, which is the insert map, and as you can see, let's expand that and expand that. I have created an index, and the index number 1 has my 3 rules in it to insert some data into the table. This is going to insert a row 3 for me. So let's build and run this map, and it should run exactly the same way as it did in Design Studio. Run complete. Okay, so there will be no actual output data, I believe, in the output card. Let's have a look. I don't think there will. No, it's blank, as I expected. But go back to test 2 now and rerun test 2, and checking the output of test 2, we now have the 3 rows because the single row got inserted, and I can double check that in my query console by just running this query again, and we've got back to 3 rows again. So there we go. That's reading and inserting data into Azure SQL using Design Server. Back at the Design Server now, and I'm going to make a couple of changes to a couple of the maps and deploy them to the REST API. Before I log in here, let me just quickly show you that there are no endpoints currently deployed to the API. We will come and deploy a couple in here shortly. Back to the Design Server screen, and let's log in. We have our IBM Azure SQL project, and in there we're going to go into test 2. Now this map we can kick off via REST, and what we want to do is change the settings of the output card, go into the action properties and say the output of this card needs to be returned to the REST API when it's executed that way. So let's click next and OK and save this map, and we can use this map to query the data. So let's do that now. We need to go home. Let's go into packages and create a package. Let's call package 1. We want to read maps from the project IBM Azure SQL. From the maps, I'm only going to deploy test 2 for now. Let's click add, and back to the home screen, and let's go into deploy. We're going to deploy to the local REST API server package 1. It's deploying now, and the deploy is completed successfully. We can verify that by checking in the Swagger UI, hit the refresh key here, and you can see that one map has been deployed and can be executed either synchronously or asynchronously. What I'm going to do now is run the map synchronously. First of all, through the Swagger front end, I'm going to click the tried out button. There's nothing to fill out for this map. This map just queries the table. So I'm going to click execute, and down here it says that it was successful and I can download the file if I want to. But I can also copy this curl command here, and in my command prompt I can paste in that curl command and have the map execute and return the content to me through the REST API, and in this case it comes in on the command line. There are my 3 rows from my database. So there we go, using the REST API to call an ITX map which connects via the Azure SQL adapter to a SQL Server instance running in the cloud, and I'm retrieving data there. Obviously the other maps will work just as well. Test 1 would retrieve it exactly the same as this does. It might need a little changing because it doesn't have an input card, and again test 3 does the insert, and as much as I would like to demonstrate that, I don't think it's very useful because it just inserts the same row each time. We could design more to have the input card take some kind of input and then insert that into the map, but that's an example for another day. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join me for this video presentation today. If you found the content interesting and informative, please hit that like button. Perhaps you could subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please follow me on Twitter at PaulBrettIBM to be informed of new content as soon as it is produced. Thank you.